Good people, welcome to the latest episode of Jonathan Thinks. I'm your host, your friendly neighborhood democracy scholar, Jonathan Collins. I have a few things on my mind, and maybe, just maybe, you've been thinking about it too. First thing on my mind, first thing that I'm thinking about here is the India Arie versus Young Miami explosion conversation that's been happening online. So, for a little bit of context, neo soul singer India Arie, who I love, right? I went live, I think it was Instagram live, and had something to say about Young Miami's summer hot banger, Spin That. And what India Arie is basically saying is that I guess there's been murmurs about boycotting the song, and she wanted to step in and address critiques that she had been receiving, I guess, from earlier comments, maybe people misconstruing what she said is that she wants us to boycott that song, Spin That. And she wanted to clear it up by saying, like, hey, I'm not telling you to boycott it. Do what you do, rock out. If you like the song, like the song. If you want to listen to it, listen to it. But I'm telling you that I don't support the song because, in her words, music has a frequency. Music literally is sound, is literally vibrations. And she's saying music has frequencies, and when those frequencies enter the mind, they are incredibly powerful. And so if you're speaking life and positivity into people through the music, then that's going to manifest. If you're speaking negativity and toxicity, that's going to manifest. And of course, it created an uproar on the internet. And I wanted to discuss this topic because I think it's arguably one of the most important debates that we can have when it comes to hip hop culture. It's the endless debate, the debate that won't go away. We keep having this conversation because it asks this larger question, right? Is hip hop culture bad for Black culture? Right. And I think there are two ways to look at this. One way to look at this is this idea that hip hop basically brainwashes Black folks into degeneracy. And if we got rid of hip hop, and especially a lot of the seedy messages that can be a part of hip hop, then we could have a cultural cleansing. And I think that's argument is obviously dangerous because that gets us into this realm of respectability politics. And it also assumes that Black folks don't know how to think for themselves, that whatever we hear in a song or whatever we see on TV and in movies, we just easily emulate that without any second thought. It also breaks down because at this point now, the biggest consumers of hip hop are not Black people, right? So if hip hop did have such an insidious effect on communities, you wouldn't see this effect solely concentrated within Black communities. You would see it much broader than that. So the idea that hip hop culture is in and of itself dragging down the Black community, that's just not true. And not only is it not true logically, but there's even been studies, like there's a big study that Roland Fryer was talking about. He has a Wall Street Journal piece where he lays this out in a TED Talk, where he gets into this pretty large data collection effort that he did to essentially analyze hip hop songs or hip hop radio stations going back, I think, 30 or 40 years, and basically using the hip hop station and its radius as a unit of analysis to see if we look at places where hip hop music is played consistently on the radio, do we see negative societal outcomes? And the answer was consistently no. So in communities where hip hop is prevalent, there were no gaps in educational attainment. There was no statistical difference in employment outcomes, and there were no higher crime rates. So you didn't see this prevalence of crime also in communities where hip hop was prevalent. So again, no evidence here that hip hop is the thing that is causing any kind of like degeneracy or any kind of group social decay that we might be attributing to hip hop. There's no evidence that it's the music that's causing that. If anything, in Fryer's piece, he makes the argument, and I agree with this, that hip hop captures the stories, man. Hip hop captures the stories. When we see these things happening in society, crime, dropping out of school, giving up on education, struggling in the workforce, having to go into different economies, underground economies. When we see these things happening, it's not because of the influence of hip hop music. It's the influence of policy that then influences our lives. And then people turn to hip hop to tell the story of what the policy essentially did to them. It's why, I really loved Section 80, Kendrick Lamar's big kind of breakout mixtape, because the argument in Section 80 is that we are growing up in the late 80s, early 90s. We are the babies of Ronald Reagan, right? His policies, his trickle down economics, his, being a part of the war on drugs and the mass incarceration, three strikes law, all these things that put Black folks in jail, that put drugs in Black communities, right? These were policy decisions. And Kendrick is saying, I'm going to show you the lives that we live now as a direct function of policy. So for him, hip hop is the ability to tell the story of what happens when policies fail Black communities. And I think that's true for the larger existence of hip hop, whether it's some of the more conscious rap like Kendrick, but you can even make the case for why you would see Young Miami rapping about scammers and spending money and throwing money in strip clubs. Believe it or not, all of this is a function of policy choices, and especially depending on where you lie on the utility of scammers and the kind of underworld life. This is a product of policy failure. I understand what India Arie is saying from a standpoint of, I do think it's important to speak positivity. Going back to Kendrick, it's funny that everybody's ganging up on India Arie and coming to bat for Young Miami's song when just, a couple of years ago, we had the big beef between Kendrick Lamar and Drake. And Kendrick's whole argument was that, dog, you're not giving us anything. You're not speaking positivity. You're not speaking life. What you're speaking to us is corrosive, right? And that, Kendrick wins this battle literally just by saying, my art is about us being better people. And I think that's also what India Arie is trying to say, that when you have the ability to make art, try your best to use your art to inspire, to uplift people and sow seeds of substance, because a lot of the violence and sexual obscenity and just misogynoir of hip hop is uniquely American. And, this really hit me when I was in Ghana. I went to Ghana. My wife and I, we went to Ghana when I was actually right before the world ended in 2019, the year of return. And I remember being at a bar club spot. We were kicking and having a good time. And, they started off the night playing Afro beats. And we're vibing to the Afro beats, and it's all about, like love and finding the one and, finding a woman and treating her right and like, wanting to love her and, and same thing, girl wanting the right guy. And, it's just, the music sounds beautiful, but it also makes you just feel, good. Like it's music that it feels like it's getting you to focus on the right things. And then later in the night, the set switched to hip hop and the messages just were so different. And it just made me feel like, wow, I don't know how I feel about this, because it went from wanting to find the love of my life to shake that ass, shake that ass, shake that ass, back that up, grab that pussy, grab the dick, blah, 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 blah. Like, it was embarrassing, honestly. It was embarrassing that, like, this is what we exported to this place. And I don't want to diminish it, because a part of that hip hop is telling, like I said, it's telling the stories of what's happening to us in our communities. And when Spin That comes on, there's, especially, as a Southerner, you relate to that sound, that vibe. Like I can see the club moving in a certain way when that song comes on. And there's a certain feeling of liberation and freedom when you can just actually just be your authentic Black self. And that kind of music does in some way help us do that. But we do have to ask the question of what we want our art to accomplish. How do we want our art to make people feel? And not just in the moment when we're in the club dancing, but when we're alone with our thoughts and we're struggling with our day to day. Like I think about the people that really would identify with that song, would Spin That. I think about the people that I know growing up who went down a particular path, scamming, robbing, doing whatever. But they want that glorified. Because when I see them reflect, I see them more so trying to find the substance and the beauty and not trying to glamorize a lifestyle that involves inflicting harm. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's nothing wrong with hip hop in the sense that hip hop is not ruining our lives. But I do think we should be a little bit more thoughtful about the kinds of stories that we tell through hip hop, because we can use it to party, but we can also use hip hop to change the world. And I'm not sure spin that is a part of the larger plan to change the world. But I'm also not convinced that spin that is a part of the process of ruining the world. And speaking of ruining things, the next thing that I'm thinking about is the National Guard literally ruining a young man's life, ending a young man's life in my home state, Tennessee, my home area, West Tennessee, where I was born and raised. Recently, Tyron Johnson was shot and killed by a couple of National Guard officer agents in Memphis, Tennessee. And there were Memphis police officers responded to a 4 a.m. call. There were gunshots in his neighborhood. Cops show up at the scene. A bunch of people flee. Johnson being one of the people. Cops go after him. They claim he had a gun, and that while he was being chased by Memphis police, the National Guard agents who saw the chase basically joined in on the chase. When Tyron Johnson stops, he turns around. They claim they saw a gun. They shoot him. You know what happens there. Now, we still got to wait for all the facts to come out. I read that the family is actively pushing for the release of body cam footage to actually confirm whether or not Tyron Johnson had a weapon. I mean, it's a heartbreaking story. These are all heartbreaking, but this is a heartbreaking story. Yeah, young kid, 20 years old. He was a student at Tennessee State University, the largest HBCU in the state of Tennessee. He's also a construction worker and a new father. And you just wish the situation could be handled differently. And it's just in Tennessee, which is an open carry state, it just feels like even if being caught with the firearm, which, like I said, it's Tennessee, it's an open carry state. Why is it that when somebody's caught with the firearm and they're gunned down by law enforcement, they got dark skin? It's just, we have an inequality problem in America, but I think more than that, we have an injustice problem, and those two things are different. The inequality problem is about the distribution of resources and wealth. And a lot of the wealth is concentrated in the top 1%. And honestly, that's a multiracial problem because there's a lot of poor white folks, just like there are a lot of poor black folks because of the hoarding of wealth. That's the inequality problem. But the injustice problem, that's where race really comes into play because there are just two systems in America, right? One if you're white, one if you're not. And in that system, for those of us who are not, being black in particular, it just makes your life expendable. It's always hard for me to believe that these police and military officers who go through constant training and prepare so much for these situations, for some reason, when there's a black suspect, they too often can't find ways to handle the situation without fatal gun violence. It just doesn't make sense to me. It just doesn't sit well with me. And I think the hardest part is that, again, I've said this before, but we're exhausted by it. We're exhausted by it. More and more black folks get killed by the police, and because of the endless names that led to the series of protests during the 2010s, but of course that culminated with the George Floyd protests in 2020. We're exhausted. And it's like that for a lot of policy issues that affect black folks in particular. When's the last time you heard someone really care about mass incarceration? Black folks haven't stopped going to prison, wrongly convicted, over-policed, being funneled into a system where the bail bond system exploits, where the list of the wait times to even see a judge when you're arrested is getting longer and longer. The conditions in prisons are not getting any better. When's the last time you heard anybody talk about mass incarceration? We don't care anymore. The same thing with these police killings. We don't care anymore. And if you think it was bad when we cared, just imagine how bad it's going to get now that we don't. So I'm talking about this Tyron Johnson situation because somebody needs to. Because if we don't, all these black bodies are going to hit the dirt with no hope of reform or change. So I just want to say, sending prayers to Tyron Johnson, the memory of him, and sending prayers to his family. I hate the term rest in peace. I just do you really think that that's what, I don't know what's appropriate about that. Like, why do you think people want to rest? Why do you think a 20-year-old I don't think a 20-year-old wants to rest in peace. I think a 20-year-old wants to live his life, and now he can't do that. And so I don't know what to say because I just want him to be able to live his life, and now he can't. Speaking of not being able to live your life, another thing that I'm thinking about at least is the political scandal in Jackson, Mississippi. So just a quick overview on this. So Chokwe Antar Lumumba, who was mayor of Jackson, Mississippi for about 8 years, I think from like 2017 to 2025. He recently pled guilty to a count of bribery. Not only did former mayor Lumumba plead guilty, but so did Aaron Banks, who's a former city council member who served alongside Lumumba. And also right before Jody Owens, who was the district attorney from Mississippi's Jackson area. made a similar plea a couple of days prior. So these are three of the highest profile local political officials, all Black, pleading guilty to bribery. And the story is really interesting to me because it's obvious here that Black political officials are being targeted. We don't get the full details of the story because the case doesn't go to trial. So the nitty gritty details are missing, but the story seems to be this, that there was this FBI sting. As a part of that sting, they got some FBI agents to essentially pretend to be these big time land developers who approached Mayor Lumumba and the folks in Jackson with an interest in building this like development in downtown Jackson. And Lumumba and others were essentially taking kickbacks for playing a role in moving the project forward and using federal funds to pay for the project. There's even this story that Lumumba and Owens meet on a yacht off the coast of Florida, and Lumumba asks for $50,000 in exchange for making a phone call to one of his city officials to move the deal forward. It's just hard for me to accept this one and believe this because I got the chance to meet Mayor Lumumba a few years ago. So when I was a professor at Brown University, Brown has a relationship with Tougaloo College, and they have an exchange program. And as a part of the exchange, they have faculty teach a class that goes down to Jackson, Mississippi, actually meets on Tougaloo's campus. We interact with Tougaloo students and we take a tour of the city and the Mississippi Delta. I taught this course twice. It was a democracy and education course that centered race and the civil rights movement. And as a part of the trip, we got to spend time with Mayor Lumumba. And nothing about that man said that he was a person that lacked integrity. He was smart. He was sharp. He seemed to care very genuinely about the people of Jackson, Mississippi. He had very grand visions for ways that he was going to, push for a series of policies and programs that were going to directly address abject poverty, the blighted conditions of the Black communities in Jackson, Mississippi. He was talking about public ownership of grocery stores and movie theaters, and he was very interested and serious about ways to make Jackson, Mississippi a more equitable place and a place where Black people really could thrive. And so it's hard for me to believe that the same man who we saw in City Hall chambers talking to us as a small group so earnestly and so intelligently would do what he's being accused of here and what he's pled guilty to. To me, it sounds like it was a scheme that the FBI came up with this scheme. They targeted him and his people. And I don't think that he did explicitly bribe these federal agents, but I suspect that there was an exchange of funds that happens in close proximity or within a certain time frame of when also phone calls were made to move things forward for this fake development plan, that on paper it was going to be impossible to expect a jury in Mississippi to acquit him. And so understand why Mayor Lumumba made the decision that he made, but it's a costly tale for a lot of Black folks, especially younger Black folks who are in politics and thinking about political careers. I get people asking me from time to time, "Oh, you should run for office. You should you should think about running for office. You'd be great. You should run for office." And I remember a conversation I had years ago when I was in graduate school with Governor Dukakis, with Mike Dukakis, who ran for president in I think what 88. And I asked Dukakis if he had any advice, and he said, "Well, if you're thinking about going into public service at all," which I didn't tell him that I was, but this was his advice. "If you're thinking about going into any kind of public service, the best thing that I can tell you to do is live modestly, live well within your means." And I think he said that because he knows the pressures that come along with being in office and being exposed to people who have resources, wealth, and will do whatever they think they can do with that wealth to influence you. It's hard to write a policy, to author a bill, to sign off on legislation where millionaires are becoming multimillionaires or becoming billionaires, and then you go back home to your same salary. It takes a person of discipline to do that, and it takes a very keen sense of discipline to understand and see when this is a form of an attack against you, because I think that's what's happening to Black politicians. It's black politicians, they're entering the space. They're not wealthy. They don't come from money. They're not rich. They need campaign donations. They need additional resources. They are vulnerable to the influence of the wealthy in a very particular way. And so if you are thinking about public service, especially if you are Black and thinking about public service, I hope you look at this story in Jackson, Mississippi. And I'm not telling you to kill your ambitions, but I'm just asking you to please be very careful. Because as much as you can do, as much influence as you can have, as much good as you can do as a public official, as a mayor, as a city council person, as a school board member, please be very careful. Because one simple trip up around conflict of interest and you could lose it all. And not only just the position, but you could lose your freedom. And no amount of power and influence is worth that. Speaking of things that aren't worth what was advertised, the last thing on my mind is this 250th anniversary of America. And I wrote a Substack about this. So, I urge you to just kind of check out my essay that I wrote on the 4th of July, breaking this down. But I hate the fact that we turned this past July 4th into this whole 250th anniversary celebration simply because it's not the 250th anniversary of America. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? This was the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The writing of the Declaration of Independence is not what made America a country. It was just basically the colonists just saying, we're pissed off. We're not going to take this anymore. It's basically the equivalent of just sending an angry email to your boss when you're going to quit and walk out. But that doesn't make you independent. It just makes you unemployed. And that's what essentially the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence is. It's a celebration of them just detaching themselves verbally from the king. In fact, like King George III, you got to remember, this is what, 1776? It probably was like a week at least before King George III even found out about this whole Declaration of Independence. It's not like they had email. So the real 250th anniversary will celebrate, I think, about 5 years, because it was 1783 when we signed the Treaty of Paris. And that's when the Revolutionary War ends. England agrees to recognize the U.S. as a country, as its own independent nation. That's the birth of the country. This 250 thing is just ridiculous. But I do think it's interesting because it causes us to reflect on, okay, 250 years. 250 years since the Declaration of Independence. Because what have we learned? And, the writing and the issuing of the Declaration of Independence was very radical. I don't want to pretend that it's not, because this is like a teenage kid living in the house, but in an abusive household. And you're 16, 17 years old, and you just decide, I can't take this anymore. And I'm leaving, and I'm out. I'm going to bounce. But the issue is that you leave the house, and you're even able to resettle somewhere else and actually start to build your own life independently of your parents. But all you know is what your parents taught you. All you know is the family business. And so that teenage boy who couldn't take any more of the abuse from his parents enacts that same abuse on those people in his new domestic situation, in his new home environment. And so how do we reconcile that? Declaration of Independence is where we celebrate the brazen radical idea of asserting your independence from a tyrant leader, of an empire that was looking to extract and limit the rights and liberties of people. But then the son, after brazenly fighting for that same independence, has lived a life of, too many times, restricting the independence of those underneath him. And so what I want for America over the next 250 years is for us to figure out how to finally shape the impulse of empire. How do we finally get out of the family business of domination, of control, of colonization, of separation, of restricting rights, of empowering the haves and disempowering the have-nots? Will, in 250 years from now, will those old habits finally die? But that's what I want to see. An America that is able to stay relevant and to stay important and to stay at the forefront and continue to lead and be the beacon of innovation and exploration and science and curiosity and discovery, while also relieving itself of the impetus to engage in acts of empire and domination. Can we put those two pieces together? That's what I want to see from America. I'll be long gone, but America at 500. And that concludes this episode of Jonathan Thinks. Again, I am Jonathan Collins, your host, your friendly neighborhood democracy scholar. Remember that every time we convene, it's an opportunity to grow. We do it with love. We do it with joy. We do it together. These are a few of my thoughts, and who knows, maybe, just maybe, you were thinking about it too. Until next time, peace.